The smallest secrets often belong to the biggest hearts. Every Friday evening, Grace Bennett followed the exact same routine with the quiet precision of someone who never expected to be noticed. As the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the Chicago skyline, she folded the simple linen apron she wore throughout the day, placed it inside a faded canvas tote, thanked the housekeeper with her usual gentle smile, and walked through the servants' entrance without looking back. She never lingered in the grand hall. She never accepted dinner from the kitchen staff. She never joined conversations that drifted through the mansion after work. Within seconds, she disappeared beyond the towering iron gates as though she had dissolved into the city itself. For nearly 3 years, nobody questioned the habit. The employees admired her work because every room she touched seemed brighter, every schedule ran smoothly, and every guest complimented the spotless estate. Grace arrived before sunrise, completed every task without complaint, and quietly returned home each evening. To everyone else, she was simply the dependable maid who never caused trouble. But Vincent Hayes had built his reputation by noticing details other people ignored. He remembered tiny changes in business negotiations, subtle expressions across conference tables, and routines that seemed too perfect to be ordinary. Grace's life followed a pattern so consistent that it eventually became impossible for him to overlook. Every other employee rewarded themselves after payday. Some bought new clothes. Others upgraded their phones, enjoyed expensive dinners, or planned weekend trips. Grace never did. Her shoes remained carefully repaired instead of replaced. The same winter coat returned every season. Her phone was held together by a transparent protective case that concealed several cracks beneath the screen. Even the lunch she packed each morning looked almost identical, prepared with careful portions and remarkable simplicity. Yet payroll records quietly revealed something impossible to ignore. Every paycheck was deposited into her account before being withdrawn almost entirely in cash within hours. Month after month, year after year, the pattern never changed. One afternoon, the estate accountant laughed while organizing employee files. Grace must be saving for something extraordinary, he joked. Another employee shrugged. Or someone keeps asking her for money. Vincent said nothing, but neither explanation satisfied him. People hiding financial struggles usually left clues. Late payments. Missed shifts. Nervous conversations. Grace carried herself with quiet peace, as though every decision she made had already been settled long ago. On another Friday evening, Vincent stood alone inside his office overlooking the front driveway. Below him, Grace accepted her paycheck with a grateful nod before placing the envelope inside her canvas bag. She adjusted the strap over her shoulder and walked through the front gate exactly as she always did, never realizing someone was watching from the second floor. Vincent waited until she disappeared around the corner before quietly collecting his car keys. He had no intention of confronting her. He simply wanted answers. As the engine started beneath the mansion's private garage, he followed at a respectful distance, convinced that before the night ended he would finally discover where every dollar she earned had been going. He never imagined that the truth waiting beyond the city lights would challenge everything he believed success was supposed to mean. Grace Bennett did not head toward the apartment district where most employees lived. Instead, she crossed 2 quiet blocks before boarding a city bus traveling west, choosing the last available seat beside the window without glancing at her phone even once. Vincent Hayes kept several vehicles behind the bus as it rolled away from the polished streets surrounding his estate and into neighborhoods where the towering office buildings slowly gave way to aging brick storefronts, family-owned diners, and small corner markets that had served the same communities for generations. The farther they traveled, the more the city seemed to change. Expensive boutiques disappeared. Neon signs became hand-painted storefronts. Sidewalks grew narrower, yet people greeted one another with easy familiarity that could never be purchased. After nearly 45 minutes, Grace stepped off the bus carrying only her faded canvas tote. Vincent parked across the street and watched from a respectful distance. She did not hurry. She walked with quiet purpose, passing several shops before entering a modest neighborhood grocery store that looked almost untouched by time. Through the front window, Vincent watched her slowly push a shopping cart down each aisle. She compared prices with remarkable patience, placing bags of rice, fresh vegetables, milk, eggs, bread, cereal, apples, chicken, toothpaste, soap, and laundry detergent into the cart. She never paused near luxury items. Every choice appeared practical, every dollar carefully considered. At the checkout counter, she opened the envelope containing her paycheck and counted each bill before handing the money to the cashier. The elderly woman behind the register smiled warmly and quietly slipped another loaf of bread into one of Grace's bags. Grace noticed immediately, gently removed it, and insisted on paying before thanking the cashier with genuine appreciation. Vincent frowned. Someone struggling financially rarely refused kindness unless pride stood in the way. Grace's expression suggested something entirely different. It was not pride. It was gratitude mixed with quiet determination. Leaving the store with 2 heavy reusable bags, she continued another several blocks until the neighborhood became even quieter. Streetlights stood farther apart, and rows of weathered homes lined the peaceful streets beneath old maple trees. Finally, she stopped in front of a small white house surrounded by a simple wooden fence that had clearly been repaired many times over the years. There was no business sign, no advertisements, and nothing that suggested anyone outside the neighborhood even knew the place existed. Before Grace reached the front porch, the front door swung open. 4 children rushed outside with joyful laughter, wrapping their arms around her as though they had been counting the minutes until she arrived. She laughed softly, handed each child one of the grocery bags, and knelt to admire a colorful drawing. Proudly held up by the youngest boy. Another little girl eagerly tugged at her sleeve, trying to tell 2 stories at once while Grace listened as though every word mattered. Vincent remained inside his car, watching the scene unfold beneath the warm porch light. One child accidentally called her mom before another quickly corrected him with a giggle, and Grace simply smiled without saying a word. Together they disappeared into the old house, leaving Vincent staring through the windshield, convinced he had finally uncovered the secret behind every missing paycheck, even though something deep inside him insisted the real truth was still waiting behind that weathered front door. Vincent Hayes remained inside his car long after the porch light faded behind drawn curtains. Everything he had witnessed seemed to confirm the conclusion forming in his mind. Grace Bennett had been living a second life that nobody at the estate knew existed. The children clearly adored her. They welcomed her with effortless affection, and the little boy who had called her mom did not sound as though he had made a mistake. Vincent considered driving away, convinced the mystery had finally been solved, yet something continued to hold him there. Years of building successful businesses had taught him one lesson above all others. The first answer was rarely the complete answer. A few minutes later, the curtains shifted slightly. From across the quiet street, Vincent caught glimpses of the small living room through the front window. Grace unpacked the groceries while the children eagerly carried food into the kitchen with remarkable teamwork. Nobody argued over treats. Nobody reached for desserts first. Even the youngest child carefully placed apples into a wooden bowl before proudly showing Grace where each item belonged. She smiled warmly and thanked every child for helping, making each simple task feel important. After washing her hands, Grace tied on a faded blue apron and began preparing dinner. While soup simmered gently on the stove, she moved from child to child, checking homework spread across an old dining table. She patiently explained a math problem to one little girl before helping another child sound out difficult words from a library book. Her attention never rushed. She treated every question as though it deserved all the time in the world. Vincent watched quietly, still convinced he was seeing an ordinary family sharing an ordinary evening. Then the front door opened again. An elderly woman entered slowly with the help of a wooden cane. Grace immediately crossed the room, hugged her gently, and kissed her forehead with genuine affection. A few moments later, 2 gray-haired men stepped inside carrying folded blankets. One wore a faded veteran's cap, while the other balanced a paper bag filled with canned vegetables. Grace greeted them with the same kindness she had shown the children, thanking them for coming before helping them settle comfortably at the table. More visitors followed. A retired teacher carrying homemade cornbread. A teenage grocery clerk still wearing his work uniform. A middle-aged nurse arriving after a long shift at a nearby clinic. Every person entered with easy familiarity, yet none behaved like relatives gathering for a family dinner. Instead, they greeted one another like neighbors who had slowly become something even stronger than family. Vincent noticed another detail that quietly unsettled every assumption he had made. Nobody called Grace Mom anymore. The children called her Miss Grace. The elderly woman called her Dear. The veterans thanked her by name. She belonged to every conversation, yet she belonged to no single household. As bowls of warm soup were served around the worn wooden table, Grace quietly waited until everyone else had food before filling her own bowl with the smallest portion. Laughter drifted through the slightly opened kitchen window, carrying a feeling of home that could never be purchased. Vincent stared at the modest house beneath the soft glow of the porch light, realizing that instead of solving the mystery, he had only uncovered an even greater one. If these people were not her family, then why did they love her as though she had spent a lifetime earning every smile inside that little house? Vincent Hayes left the neighborhood just before midnight, but the quiet house stayed with him long after the city lights disappeared behind his windshield. He had expected betrayal, hidden debts, or some secret life that explained why Grace Bennett never seemed to keep a single paycheck for herself. Instead, he had found something that refused to fit any explanation. By the time the sun rose over Chicago, curiosity had replaced every suspicion. Before his first meeting that morning, Vincent called Daniel Brooks, the trusted investigator who had spent years uncovering facts that most people believed could never be found. Vincent placed a single photograph of Grace on the desk. "I want to know everything about that house," he said calmly. "But nobody there is to be disturbed. They deserve their privacy." Daniel nodded without asking unnecessary questions. For days later, he returned carrying a thin folder that looked almost disappointingly ordinary. Vincent opened it expecting property records and financial statements. Instead, every page quietly dismantled the story he had imagined. The weathered house belonged to a non-profit neighborhood trust that had operated for more than 2 decades. It had once served as a community shelter before funding gradually disappeared. Volunteers had kept the doors open through donations, determination, and countless unpaid hours. The elderly woman Vincent had seen was Margaret Ellis, a retired elementary school principal. One of the older men was a former firefighter. The other was a military veteran who now volunteered whenever his health allowed. The children all came from different families facing temporary hardships. Some stayed after school while parents worked late shifts. Others visited because grandparents could no longer care for them alone during the day. None of them shared Grace's last name. None of them were related to one another. Vincent turned another page. Grace Bennett held no official position at the shelter. She was not the director, an employee, or even a board member. Yet for almost 8 years, she had quietly paid utility bills, purchased groceries, replaced broken appliances, supplied school materials, and covered emergency expenses using her own earnings. Every dollar she spent had been given freely without contracts, recognition, or public acknowledgement. Daniel placed one final document on the desk. "I spoke with several neighbors," he said softly. They all told the same story. Nobody remembers exactly when Grace became part of this place. They only know that whenever something went wrong, she somehow found a way to help before anyone had to ask. Vincent looked through several photographs taken during local fundraising events. In every picture, Grace stood in the background helping someone else. She never faced the camera. She never stood beside donation signs. She seemed almost determined to remain invisible. Vincent slowly closed the folder and leaned back in silence. For years he had believed that influence belonged to the people whose names appeared on buildings and newspaper headlines. Yet the woman who quietly cleaned his home every morning had transformed an entire neighborhood without asking anyone to remember her name. At that moment, Vincent realized the mystery had finally been solved, but the truth he discovered left him with a question far more difficult than the one he had started with. How could someone who possessed so little continue giving as though they would never run out of kindness? Vincent Hayes had reviewed thousands of financial reports throughout his career, but none had ever unsettled him the way Grace Bennett's quiet history did. Every document Daniel Brooks had uncovered answered one question while creating another that seemed impossible to measure with numbers alone. Why would someone who had so little continue giving without expecting anything in return? Sensing the question before it was spoken, Daniel placed one final envelope on the desk. This took longer to find, he explained. Most of it came from archived community records and newspaper files. Vincent carefully opened the envelope and unfolded a faded newspaper clipping from nearly 15 years earlier. It told the brief story of a neighborhood food drive organized during one of Chicago's harshest winters. Among several volunteers was a teenage girl named Grace Bennett. She had declined to be photographed and refused public recognition. After spending every weekend helping distribute meals. Another article from years later described the same young woman collecting school supplies for children before classes resumed each fall. Again, no interviews. No speeches. No requests for attention. The final page contained a handwritten note copied from an old interview with Margaret Ellis. When asked why Grace continued helping the shelter despite working long hours and earning an ordinary income, Margaret had smiled before answering with words she said Grace repeated only once. "When I was a little girl, someone I never knew brought me dinner, gave me a warm coat, and reminded me that I still mattered." Before she walked away, she said, "When life finally gives you enough, become someone else's miracle." I never saw her again, but I promised myself I would never let her kindness end with me. Vincent quietly lowered the page onto his desk. The room around him suddenly felt unusually still. Somewhere in the city, a stranger whose name had been forgotten had changed the future simply by choosing compassion for one frightened child. That single act had quietly multiplied across countless lives for more than a decade. Later that morning, Grace arrived at the estate exactly as she always did. She greeted the gardeners as she crossed the courtyard, thanked the delivery driver for bringing fresh produce, and noticed a loose button on one of the kitchen towels before anyone else did. She repaired it herself instead of throwing it away. Nothing about her behavior suggested someone carrying an extraordinary story. She never spoke about the shelter. She never mentioned the children. She never hinted that nearly every paycheck disappeared before sunrise because she had already decided someone else needed it more. Vincent watched from the dining room doorway as Grace carefully arranged fresh flowers across the long table. Every movement reflected the same quiet care he had overlooked for years. He suddenly understood that generosity was not something she occasionally practiced. It had become the way she lived every ordinary day. For the first time since inheriting everything his family had built, Vincent questioned the meaning of success itself. He had spent years believing wealth was measured by what remained after spending. Grace had quietly proven that true abundance could be measured by what remained in the hearts of others after someone chose to give. The following Friday arrived with gray clouds hanging low above Chicago, but Vincent Hayes noticed something different long before the rain began. For the first time in years, his schedule no longer felt like the most important part of his day. While executives discussed quarterly projections and expansion plans, his thoughts kept returning to the little neighborhood shelter where every dollar seemed to create hope instead of headlines. Late that afternoon, he invited Daniel Brooks into his office once again. This meeting required no investigation. It required discretion. Vincent slid a blank notepad across the desk and spoke with unusual calm. Find out what the shelter needs before they know they need it. Use local charities, community grants, trusted contractors, and anonymous donations. I do not want Grace Bennet to think someone is trying to repay her. I only want the people there to have one less burden tomorrow than they have today. Daniel studied him for a moment before asking the only practical question. What is the budget? Vincent looked toward the city skyline beyond his office window and quietly smiled. Whatever it takes. Within days, quiet improvements began appearing throughout the neighborhood. The aging furnace that struggled every winter was replaced before the first cold front arrived. A local roofing company volunteered to repair the leaking roof after receiving an anonymous sponsorship. The neighborhood grocery store announced that fresh produce would be delivered every Friday through a new community assistance program. A nearby pharmacy informed Margaret Ellis that several recurring prescriptions had already been covered by an unnamed donor. New shelves appeared in the reading room along with carefully selected children's books, educational games, and comfortable chairs that made the small library feel welcoming again. Every gift arrived through a different source, leaving no obvious trail. Connecting one act of generosity to another. Grace noticed the changes almost immediately. One Friday evening she paused inside the pantry, quietly staring at neatly organized shelves filled with healthy food that had not been there the week before. Margaret walked beside her, equally puzzled. I have called every organization I know, the older woman admitted softly. Everyone says someone else paid for it. Grace rested her fingertips against one of the new wooden shelves before smiling with peaceful gratitude. Maybe kindness has a way of finding places that refuse to give up, she answered. Across the street, Vincent sat inside his parked car beneath the familiar maple tree, watching from a respectful distance. He saw children laughing while carrying books into the reading room. He watched the retired firefighter carefully test the repaired wheelchair ramp before helping Margaret safely across it. He noticed neighbors who had once come seeking assistance now arriving with homemade meals to share with others. Hope seemed to spread quietly from one person to the next, asking for nothing except the chance to continue. As evening settled over the neighborhood, Grace remained alone in the kitchen after everyone had gone home. She looked around the peaceful room before softly whispering a simple prayer of thanks for whoever had remembered their forgotten corner of the city. Vincent could not hear every word through the closed window, but he understood enough. As he slowly drove away beneath the glowing streetlights, he realized that giving anonymously had changed him far more deeply than receiving recognition ever had, and for the first time in his life, success no longer felt complete unless it quietly made someone else's tomorrow a little brighter. Several weeks passed, and the quiet improvements around the shelter continued to appear with almost perfect timing. Every time a problem threatened to grow into a crisis, someone had already solved it. The old refrigerator that struggled to keep fresh food cold was replaced before it finally stopped working. New winter coats arrived just as the weather forecast warned of dropping temperatures. Boxes of school supplies appeared the weekend before classes resumed. Grace Bennet accepted every blessing with gratitude, yet a quiet question slowly settled into her heart. Whoever was helping seemed to know exactly what the shelter needed before anyone had the chance to ask. One Friday evening, after the community dinner ended and the last dishes had been washed, Grace carried a box of donated books toward the small storage shed behind the house. The neighborhood had grown peaceful beneath the warm glow of streetlights when she noticed the familiar black sedan parked beneath the large maple tree across the street. She had seen the same vehicle several Fridays in a row, always arriving before sunset and quietly leaving after everyone else had gone home. At first she believed it belonged to one of the neighbors. Now she knew that explanation no longer made sense. Instead of turning toward the shed, Grace gently placed the box on the porch and walked across the empty street with calm, unhurried steps. Inside the car, Vincent Hayes had been watching two children chase fireflies across the front yard when he realized Grace was walking directly toward him. He considered driving away, but something told him that running from the truth would erase every lesson she had unknowingly taught him. He lowered the driver's window before she reached the door. For a few quiet moments, neither of them spoke. Grace looked at him with surprise, but there was no anger in her expression. Only quiet curiosity. "Mr. Hayes," she said softly. "I thought I recognized this car." Vincent gave a small nod. "You did." She glanced toward the shelter before returning her eyes to him. "You have been here more than once." It was not an accusation. It sounded like someone gently placing the final piece into a puzzle that had taken weeks to complete. Vincent drew a slow breath. "The first night I came because I wanted answers," he admitted. "Every night after that, I came because I found something I had been missing for a very long time." Grace remained silent, allowing him to continue at his own pace. Finally, she asked the question she already seemed to know the answer to. "The repairs, the groceries, the medicine, the books, was that your doing?" Vincent lowered his eyes with a humility he had rarely shown anyone. "I hoped you would never find out," he answered honestly. Grace smiled with gentle warmth instead of surprise. She looked toward the brightly lit house where neighbors were still laughing together through the open windows. "Thank you," she whispered. Vincent shook his head almost immediately. "No," he replied. "Thank you. I spent years believing money could build a meaningful life. Then I watched someone earning an ordinary paycheck quietly build hope for an entire neighborhood." Grace's eyes softened as she listened. "You already had generosity inside you," she said gently. "Sometimes people only need someone to remind them where to look." Standing beneath the quiet evening sky, Vincent realized that the greatest gift Grace had ever given the shelter was not the food she carried or the bills she paid. It was the example she lived every single day, and without ever intending to, she had changed the course of his own life as well. After that quiet conversation beneath the maple tree, nothing changed on the surface, yet everything felt different. Vincent Hayes no longer watched Grace Bennett from a distance because there was no longer a reason to hide. Instead, every Friday evening after finishing his work, he stopped by the neighborhood shelter carrying nothing that would draw attention to himself. Sometimes he unloaded boxes of fresh fruit from a local market. Other times he helped stack folding chairs after community dinners or carried heavy bags of donated clothing into the storage room. Grace never introduced him as a wealthy businessman or an influential employer. To everyone there, he was simply Vincent, another neighbor willing to lend a hand. At first, the children seemed shy around him. They thanked him politely but returned to playing with one another. Vincent accepted that without disappointment. He had spent most of his adult life negotiating contracts instead of building trust with children. He understood that respect could never be purchased. It had to be earned one small moment at a time. One rainy Saturday afternoon, while helping organize books in the reading room, Vincent noticed a young boy sitting alone by the window holding a broken model airplane. The child stared at the missing wing with quiet frustration. Without saying much, Vincent pulled a small tube of glue and a roll of clear tape from the supply cabinet. Together they carefully repaired the airplane, smoothing each edge until it looked ready to fly again. When the boy tossed it across the room and watched it glide almost perfectly, his face lit up with the kind of joy Vincent rarely witnessed inside corporate boardrooms. From that day forward, the children began seeking him out with simple questions about homework, puzzles, and school projects. Grace observed the quiet transformation with a gentle smile. She recognized something Vincent had not yet noticed himself. The man who once measured every hour by productivity had slowly learned to value moments that produced nothing except laughter. One evening, Margaret Ellis invited everyone to gather for dinner after the weekly food distribution. Long tables filled the modest hall with homemade casseroles, warm bread, fresh vegetables, and apple pie donated by neighbors. Before anyone began eating, Margaret stood and cleared her throat. "Tonight," she said warmly, "I would like to thank every person who has kept this house alive. Some have given money. Some have given time. Others have simply shown kindness when someone needed it most. No matter what you brought, every gift mattered." She looked around the room before smiling toward Grace and Vincent without mentioning either of their names. Communities are not built by extraordinary people. They are built by ordinary people who continue showing up for one another. The room filled with quiet applause. Vincent looked across the table at Grace. She simply smiled and returned her attention to serving soup to the children before filling her own bowl, exactly as she always had. Watching her, Vincent finally understood why she had never wanted recognition. Once kindness became a performance, it slowly stopped being kindness at all. As voices and laughter filled the old shelter with warmth, Vincent realized that the greatest investment he had ever made would never appear on a balance sheet. It lived instead inside grateful hearts, shared meals, repaired dreams, and a community that had quietly taught two very different people that the richest life was always the one shared with others. Spring arrived quietly in Chicago, and with it came small signs that hope had taken root in places where hardship had once seemed permanent. Flowers bloomed beneath the shelter's front windows. The reading room remained full every afternoon with children finishing homework before racing outside to play. The pantry shelves no longer stood half empty, and the old building that had once struggled to survive now felt alive with laughter nearly every day of the week. Grace Bennett continued living exactly as she always had. Every Friday she boarded the same city bus after work, carrying grocery bags, school supplies, or whatever the neighborhood needed most. She still arrived before everyone else, prepared meals, listened to worried parents, encouraged discouraged children, and quietly slipped away after making certain every light had been turned off. She never asked for recognition because she had never believed kindness needed an audience. Vincent Hayes also kept his promise to let generosity remain anonymous whenever possible. He continued supporting the shelter through trusted community organizations, but he no longer measured success by the size of his businesses alone. Instead, he reserved time every week for the people who had unknowingly transformed his understanding of purpose. His employees gradually noticed subtle changes as well. Scholarship programs quietly expanded. Paid volunteer days became available throughout every company he owned. Local charities received support without lengthy publicity campaigns. Many people praised Vincent's leadership, never realizing that the greatest lesson he had ever learned came not from a boardroom but from watching one ordinary woman spend an ordinary paycheck with extraordinary compassion. One Friday evening, nearly a year after Vincent had first followed Grace through the city streets, the shelter celebrated its annual community gathering. Families, volunteers, teachers, firefighters, nurses, veterans, and neighbors filled the yard with picnic tables, homemade food, music, and children's laughter. Margaret Ellis welcomed everyone before inviting the youngest children to plant a small maple tree near the front entrance. She explained that strong trees began with roots nobody could see, just as strong communities began with quiet acts of kindness that often remained unnoticed. As the children carefully covered the young tree with fresh soil, Grace stood beside Vincent watching them smile with hopeful excitement. "Do you think they will remember today when they grow older?" Vincent asked softly. Grace looked toward the little tree swaying gently in the evening breeze. "Maybe not every detail," she answered with her familiar gentle smile. "But they will remember how this place made them feel. And one day, when someone else needs hope, that feeling will guide them." Vincent nodded slowly, understanding at last that kindness was never truly finished. Every generous act continued growing inside someone else's future long after the moment itself had passed. As the sun settled behind the Chicago skyline, children laughed beneath the newly planted maple tree while neighbors gathered for one more shared meal. Watching them together, Vincent realized that the greatest secret he had followed that first Friday night had never been Grace's destination. It had been the quiet truth that one compassionate heart could change countless lives without asking the world to notice. And perhaps that was the greatest wealth anyone could ever leave behind, because while money could build walls and buy comfort, only kindness could build a place where strangers became family, hope outlived hardship, and every small act of love continued echoing long after the giver had walked away.